About 6 years ago, we instigated the NSA Lectureship, which was designed to bring a speaker from outside of NSA to visit once a term over the course of the year and lecture on a topic of their choice. Previous holders of that lectureship include Dr. Mark Jones, our own Dr. Harmon, Michael McClanahan. Last year was Jonathan Gibson. And it gives me great delight to introduce you to you this afternoon, the holder of the lectureship for this coming academic year, who is Dr. David Talcott, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the King's College in New York City. His primary research interest is Greek philosophy, and he has a forthcoming book on Plato with P&R Publishing. He did his BA in philosophy at Hillsdale College and a PhD in philosophy from Indiana University, Bloomington. He resides in New Jersey with his wife Anna and their 6 children, and we are delighted that he is holding the lectureship for this year. Overall, the title of that lectureship is Plato, a Christian Appraisal. So please give a very warm welcome to Dr. David Talcott.
Well, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for being here. I am honored to be with you this afternoon and to be holding this lectureship and looking forward to my visits over the course of this year. I have a number of connections with this institution. It's good to see a few old friends here, and I'm looking forward to making some new ones. You should know that you have many people who admire what you are attempting here around the country and around the world. So it sometimes feels like you're alone in things, I think, from time to time, and know that there are others that are like-minded, but don't let it go to your heads. So over the course of these lectures, I want to introduce the main contours of Plato's thought and to evaluate him in the light of Christian truth. Alfred North Whitehead, a British idealist philosopher, famously said this: "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." That is a man who's worth understanding, both for his intrinsic merits as well as his historical influence. Not long before Whitehead, another more famous philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, grouped Plato in with Christianity as part of the old, dead world that he was leaving behind in the dust. As he considers the way that he and other radicals are pressing forward with their nihilism, he writes this in his work, The Gay Science. "But you will have gathered what I am driving at, namely that it is still a metaphysical faith upon which our faith in science rests. That even we seekers after knowledge today, we godless anti-metaphysicians, still take our fire too from the flame lit by a faith that is thousands of years old. That Christian faith, which was also the faith of Plato, that God is the truth, that truth is divine." But what if this should become more and more incredible? If nothing should prove to be divine anymore unless it were error, blindness, the lie? If God himself should prove to be our most enduring lie? So why does Plato lump together, why does Nietzsche lump together Plato with Christianity? Why does he see them as a joint target? I hope that by the end of this lecture series, that's something that will make sense to you. On the other end of the spectrum, we see Christians with both a positive and a negative view of Plato. You can find both if you look. It's in fact common today for Christians to blast Plato for his purported dualism, or for his rationalism, or for one of many other supposed maladies. James K.A. Smith, for instance, wrote this in a recent article in the Christian Century. Quote, "After millennia, it remains hard to shake the baseline Platonic picture of the human person, in which reason rules the passions and emotions. I'm skeptical." So that's Jamie Smith, very skeptical of the Platonic picture, not really a big fan. Maybe closer to home, Reformed theologians such as John Frame and Cornelius Van Til have not exactly been kind to Plato, arguing that his view is man-centered and untenable. If you look elsewhere, however, you can see that many Christians in the past did not approach Plato in this kind of way. In comparison to other ancient philosophers, Plato was highly regarded among the early church fathers. Justin Martyr thought Plato must have borrowed from Moses, so Christian was his thinking. Does he deserve that reputation? Augustine, in his Confessions, famously claims that God used the Platonic books to cast out a range of philosophical errors. He says he learned from them to seek for immaterial truth. Although later in his retractions, Augustine wrote something different. Later he said, "The praise with which I so greatly extolled Plato and the Platonists, or the academic philosophers, was most inappropriate for these impious persons, and has rightly displeased me." He thought he had gone too far. The great Lutheran reformer Philip Melanchthon said, "Let us love both Plato and Aristotle." And Luther himself, not a big fan of philosophers, said that Plato is better than the philosophy of Aristotle. So in this series of talks, I want to explore the good and the bad of Plato, and to try to appraise his ideas in the light of Christian truth. So let's dive in together, shall we? Plato's Republic is his most well-known work and most widely read, and after that, it is likely the Apology. In Plato's Apology, he has the character of Socrates argue that the health of the soul is more important than the well-being of the body. He rebukes his fellow Athenians for being more concerned with power, status, and bodily health than they are with the health of their souls. In an ethical way, this illustrates the most fundamental commitment of Platonism. The most distinctive metaphysical feature of Platonism is this: an unrelentingly spiritual orientation to the world. For a Platonist, the spiritual is more fundamental and more real than the body. That contrast of bodily and spiritual is, I think, above all, the distinctive mark of Platonism. This contrast has huge ethical and social implications, which I'm planning on talking about at my next visit. It has huge theological and soteriological implications, which I plan on talking about in later talks as well. For today, I want to drive down on the core areas of philosophy, metaphysics, and epistemology. What exists at a basic level for Plato, and how do we know about what exists? Contrasts can often bring clarity, so I want to introduce you to Plato's primary intellectual targets. Ancient philosophy is actually a great intellectual adventure. The back and forth is quite exciting, and I want you to see some of the targets that Plato is aimed at as well in his work. Plato did not come to his ideas in a vacuum. He builds on early Greek philosophy and responds to early Greek philosophy as well as popular movements in his time. So to dig into his metaphysics, consider that the first and perhaps clearest target he seeks to intellectually critique is materialism. You might think materialism was invented in the 20th century. I can assure you it was not. It was alive and well in the 5th century BC and probably in the 7th century BC. From the time philosophy emerged in ancient Greece, materialism remained a constant temptation. The earliest philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes from Miletus, they produced accounts of the world which made matter the fundamental explanatory principle. Thales argued that everything was made of water. Anaximander, that there was an indeterminate physical substance that controlled and steered everything, and that everything came out of and returned back to. Anaximenes argued that air, either more compressed or more rarefied, was the material substance underlying everything. These early philosophers explained the universe by its material properties. So that didn't just pop into the world in the 20th century or something like that. That is 25 centuries old. Only a few years later, during Socrates and Plato's lifetimes, the philosophers Leucippus and Democritus introduced the idea of an atom. Atomism is the paradigmatic materialism in the history of the West. An atom, prior to the 19th century, when all of science changed with new experimentation, prior to that, an atom was simply a small, uncuttable piece of material. It's a minuscule particle that cannot be divided into smaller pieces. Democritus argued that everything we perceive is composed of atoms. And the changing arrangement of the atoms explains the changing perceptions that we experience. When atoms are packed closely together, the material seems hard. When atoms are sharp and pointy, the food tastes bitter, and so forth. At the most basic level, atomism holds that all that exists are atoms and the void. The void is just empty space that the atoms are bouncing around in, moving around in. And all change is explained through the movement of these atoms through the space. Sometimes they bounce off each other and move around. Other times they grab onto each other and clump up into medium-sized objects like us and the chairs that we're sitting on. Democritus famously wrote, "By convention sweet, by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, but in reality, atoms and the void." As materialism usually does, this materialism undermined belief in universal ethical truth, and this Plato found to be deeply problematic. So Plato makes it a central task of his to argue against materialism, and instead to show that a spiritual, non-physical world exists. In fact, it exists more than anything else in the world. It's the fundamental ordering and structuring principle of all things. What the earliest philosophers thought could be explained by matter and material principles, Plato argues can only be explained by spirit. All right, so how does Plato argue this? Well, he argues there are features of our experience which cannot be explained by matter alone. When we look at the world with our eyes and reflect on the world with our minds, we can see that materiality cannot be the entire story. You don't have to be a foolish follower of pagan mythology to believe in the spiritual realm. Plato argues there are some things that are clearly real, but which clearly cannot be physical. Let's look at some examples. Take beauty, for instance. We say there is such a thing as beauty. In fact, Plato often starts his discussions with his interlocutors by getting them to agree. We say there is such a thing as X, or we say there is such a thing as Y. And then they're stuck having to talk about it because they use the term, so now they have to defend themselves. So we say there's such a thing as beauty, and many different things are beautiful. A sunset is beautiful. A diamond ring is beautiful. The Empire State Building is beautiful. Can the beauty of these things be physical? Well, it's hard to see how. Here's how Plato reasons. A diamond ring is tiny. Is beauty in the smallness of the size? Empire State Building is vast and overwhelming. You can be small or large and be beautiful either way. The ring is circular. The Empire State Building is blocky. Beauty's not in the shape. Perhaps you're thinking it's the color. The sunset has a rich color that makes it beautiful. Purples, oranges, and reds. And yet the Empire State Building is gray, almost drab. Beauty is not in the color. In fact, there's no physical attribute just that you see with your eyes or perceive with your senses that's shared between all of these various beautiful things. There's nothing physically in common between these different beautiful things. Beauty is real, but it's not merely material. It's clearly present and exists there, but it's not just the atoms or the stuff that something is made of. Its fundamental being is not physical, but rational and spiritual. It resides in a different realm. Beauty is not the only thing like this. Let's take another example. Take a human being. You are human, as am I. And yet human beings come in a vast array of sizes, colors, shapes, and so forth. Most humans have certain kinds of structures, but some humans are born missing limbs and other things. At a purely physical level, it's difficult to see what we have in common. Strictly speaking, at an atomic level, if you're thinking that kind of science, we do not have any physical material in common. Your body is composed of one set of atoms, my body is composed of another. And yet we're both human beings. There must be something that we share if we're right to call both of us by the same name. At a structural level, there clearly is something that's shared. We possess a certain order or bodily organization that is the same. We're the same not because of the atoms we're made of, but because of the form or organization we possess. We're the same because of what we are, not just the matter our bodies are composed out of. That what it is something present in the physical, but is not itself physical. These are the famous forms that Plato talks about. The form of human being in our case. It's that non-physical thing, which, when it comes to be present in something physical, makes that physical thing to be of a certain kind or category, in this case, human. When the matter comes to participate in that form, it becomes a new thing. Plato has other arguments and examples, but the root idea is just this. Things have a rational structure, which gives them order and makes them what they are. It makes them function in the world in a distinct way. This rational structure, it has being beyond just the physical. It's not reducible to the physical. The physical, in fact, only is what it is through participation in this greater rational and spiritual realm that is structured and ordered. Famously, Plato creates two worlds. The world perceived by the senses, the bodily visible world of material stuff, and the world perceived by the mind, the rational, invisible world. The world of the senses is impermanent and shifting. More on that later. The world of reason is eternal and unchanging. Individual things may become more or less beautiful, but beauty itself never changes. Individual dogs may come and go out of existence, but what it is to be a dog never changes. These two worlds are, of course, only two different aspects of the same world. There's only one world, but they're two aspects of it. One eternal and unchanging, the other transitory and quickly shifting. And between the two, it's the spiritual that is more fundamental and even real than the physical. Physical realm derives its being and reality from the spiritual. If beauty didn't exist, Plato thinks these arguments show, nothing could be beautiful. If there were no such thing as what it is to be a human being, then no human beings would exist anywhere. Even the colors and shapes that are basic to physical objects, they too have a nature or essence which makes them what they are. There is such a thing as redness and being circular. These forms are also, Plato also uses the term essence. So he actually uses two terms for forms, eidos and ideia. And by essence, he uses the term ousia, it just means being. The former essence is what the thing really is. I've already been using that kind of language. That's how he describes it. And so back to the original question and the examples here, we cannot explain the world around us without including things beyond the material, namely forms or essences, these non-physical attributes. They make things what they are, even more than the material out of which things are composed. They show us what kind of thing something is, where it fits in the overall scheme of the world. It's not just that thing, it's this particular kind of thing. Individual things become what they are through participation in these non-physical essences. And the relationship between these worlds is not symmetrical. The material depends upon the spiritual. It's the spiritual, the rational, the non-physical that structures the physical. The physical only is what it is through its incomplete, although genuine, participation in that more than physical realm. Plato famously talks about this world of the forms, which if you sat in a class on Plato, you might have gotten sick of those. This world of the forms as being perfect, and the physical world is only deficiently participating in the spiritual. All right, and we can explore this in the Q&A if we want. That doesn't mean the physical is automatically bad on Plato's account, but it's dependent and inferior compared to the spiritual. Now, at a poetic level, if nothing else, this view seems true and right, although we may have all sorts of objections to the broader picture. There is a pervasive spiritual reality and a rational reality that surrounds us, and that's certainly true. We should recognize more and more the pervasive reality of the spiritual and its effects on the physical. Plato moves that spiritual world from one of nymphs and centaurs into a world of rational kinds. In Christianity, there's room for both angels and natural laws. In creating, God made everything out of nothing by the word of his power. Creation's the manifestation of the glory of God's eternal power, wisdom, and goodness. Physical did, in fact, come from the spiritual in the Christian account of reality. That the world is structured rationally and orderly is implied by it being caused by God's wisdom. So Platonism, in its insistence on reality and on the reality and fundamentality of the spiritual, the non-physical, fits well with that picture. Although, of course, we'll see as we continue to probe his theology and his soteriology, we'll have some concerns. That's putting it mildly. We'll have some serious problems with how he deals with some of those topics. There's another anti-materialist aspect to Platonism that I want to note, and that is his commitment to teleology. In a materialist world, nothing acts for the sake of any purpose or any end. If all that exists are atoms and the void, then the only causes that exist are chance and necessity. Ancient atomists like Leucippus and Democritus recognized and embraced these materialist implications. Plato rejected it. And Aristotle, too, rejected it. He argued that instead that purposes and ends, goals, things that we aim at, purposeful conclusions, intentional conclusions, ends, teloi, these are present in the world. Things move toward goals. They aren't just pushed from behind by force. The clearest example of this is human beings. We certainly do not move just by force. We move rationally, intentionally. You all decided to come here on a Friday afternoon. You had other options available to you. Why did you come? You're saying, I had no options, I was coerced. Well, when you are coerced, you have options. You can choose to comply or not. Maybe you came because your friends would look down on you if you skipped it. Maybe you just like to see exciting speeches. Maybe you had a sincere desire for the truth. Whatever reason you had, you came because you judged it good to come. You judged this course of action to be best, even if you didn't make the choice very consciously. If I were to ask you why you are here, and you gave me an answer like this, what would we all think? Suppose you say, I'm here because my body is made of flesh and bones. My legs have large joints connected by tendons and ligaments, And when the muscles of my legs contract, the bones swing in their sockets and move locations. And so I flexed my muscles, and now I am here. We would say, okay, that is an interesting story about the body, but it doesn't give the best explanation for why you are here. It doesn't say why you made the decision to move your body in that way to come to this place. You're here because you judged it good or even best to be here, based on the available options. At the human level, this is the deepest kind of explanation, deepest answer to the question, why? Plato gives exactly this kind of analysis in his dialogue, The Phaedo, when explaining why Socrates is still sitting in jail, even after his friend Crito had offered a bribe to the guard to get him out. Socrates could have gone elsewhere, he could have fled punishment, but he judged it best to stay and receive the punishment from the city of Athens. Reason acts for the sake of the good. This will be important when we come to examine Plato's ethics. For now, we should note that Plato thinks the entire universe, all of creation, is rationally ordered and aimed at these goals or purposes. He says in his dialogue, the Timaeus, that the God who organized this universe was good and desired to make the world as much like himself as possible. Reason organizes things for the sake of the good. That's a teleological notion, a purposeful notion. It's not just matter being pushed around by necessity and force. It's matter being moved by reason towards a final end. The order and beauty the universe exhibits, its proportion and ratio and mathematical precision, show that things in nature have been organized by a divine craftsman. It's not just humans that move in this way. The whole world is moving towards an end. In the Republic, as Socrates is explaining the education that the city's guardians will receive, he explains that the rational realm itself has a structure and order within itself. And I'm going to diverge for a moment and talk about that. It's connected to this teleological point. As we study and learn the unchanging truths about the order of creation, that order, the non-physical realm itself, is structured and organized. We can ascend in our studies from lesser to higher things. Oak trees are plants. Plants are living beings. Living beings are substances of a certain kind, and so forth. We ascend higher and higher towards knowledge of what is most ultimate and fundamental. As he explains this in the Republic at one point, and gets closer to describing what's at the very top, he acknowledges that languages and concepts are failing him. He cannot really grasp it and understand. But he does say that the greatest form, the thing at the top of the rational structure of this intelligible realm, the greatest form, the source of the others, is not being or truth, as we might suppose. It's the good. Behind all that happens, even all that is, the good itself is the cause of all else and the source towards which all things tend. Goodness in Plato's thinking, this is an official statement, and later Platonists seem to endorse this as well, is that goodness is higher even than truth, beauty, and being. We're now in very deep waters, and I intend to back up very carefully and come up for air. I explore this route again just to draw attention to the fact that teleology and purpose are deep features of the universe for Plato, ones that are explanatory both for human action and for why all this stuff is here the way that it is. This all didn't come about by chance. It all came about by purpose, because there was a good end that was aimed at. It is a real tragedy, I think, that Plato did not correctly and fully grasp the Creator, separate from creation, containing infinite goodness in himself as a person. But as I said, more on that in a future lecture. Let's back up now, and let's go down another lane. We've been talking about Plato's metaphysics and his arguments against materialism, things that he thinks show from experience and rational reflection on experience that materialism cannot be true. I want to turn now to knowledge and Plato's account of knowledge and talk about some of the main features of that. And again, I beg your pardon on a Friday afternoon to subject you to a long discourse on Platonic metaphysics and epistemology. How is it that we're able to know this rational realm? Seems very spooky, perhaps. The short answer is this: we know about this rational realm and the forms that compose it through philosophical inquiry. We have to search, we have to investigate, we have to seek understanding. And our method of inquiry is argument. People make proposals, and we test them through arguments. If a view can withstand interrogation, then we'll believe it to be true, at least provisionally. So it's primarily a process of reasoning, of thinking, of investigating the mental structure of the world. But the senses do play a key role in coming to understand the forms, even though reason at the end of the day has to contemplate their essences on their own, on its own. In investigating the nature of piety or holiness in Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, he does so by giving examples. A definition is proposed, and then it is examined. It's a good thing to have a Q&A after a lecture, so it's not just someone talking to you, but investigating, challenging, questioning, and searching and looking. This is all through Plato's dialogues, the Socratic method and all this stuff. Right? A definition is proposed, and then it gets examined and cross-examined. And counterexamples get offered from experience. Right? You say things work this way, but what about this? How does this fit with it? The counterexamples often show that proposed definitions of different forms are deficient in some way, too narrow, too broad, not explanatory enough, and so forth. Another illustration, one you may have read in some of your classes, Book 1 of the Republic, where Socrates, Callicles, Thrasymachus are discussing the nature of justice. Well, one proposed definition is this: justice is the repayment of what one owes. So Socrates examines that account. He raises a counterexample, one where he thinks it would be unjust to repay what has been borrowed. So suppose a friend loans you a weapon. And this is hypothetical because I have no idea what the rules are about that sort of thing here. Then later, suppose he comes back to you in a drunken rage and says, "I've just found out my girlfriend was cheating on me. I'm going to go kill her. Give me my weapon back." Should you repay what you owe to your friend? Would that be just to do? Would that be righteous to do? Plato thinks, no, it would not. The right thing to do there is definitely not to give him anything that he could use to harm somebody else in that moment. If he comes to his senses later, then it will be a different discussion. Is justice simply the repayment of debts? No, it is not. Plato thinks, how did we discover that? We examined it and investigated it. Particular life experiences are important for reminding us of the truth of various ideas. They can point us in the right direction if we pay proper attention to the signs. Argument helps us to do that. Plato writes, perhaps too optimistically in the Republic, this is later on now in Book 7, dialectic, this back and forth argument investigation, is the only method of inquiry that, doing away with hypotheses, journeys to the first principle itself in order to be made secure. And when the eye of the soul is really buried in a sort of barbaric bog, dialectic gently pulls it out, leads it upward, using the crafts we described to help it and cooperate with it in turning the soul around. So Plato thinks that through this kind of process of argument based on experience, our minds can ascend upward and we can eventually grasp the true definitions of things that are. Eventually, as we search, we can find the truth about how the world is structured and ordered. Knowing that we are looking for the definitions of different forms actually gives us a direction to search. We're not just looking for physical stuff, we're looking for these spiritual, rational, structuring realities. We seek what is common and the same in each instance of the form. We seek that feature or aspect of it that makes it what it is, its essence. So he writes in the Republic again, similar place, to arrive through reason at the being of each thing itself, and not give up until he grasps what good itself is with understanding itself. To do this is to reach the end of the intelligible realm. Now, this is very bad advice theologically, where it's crucially important to begin with God's self-revelation, his special revelation in Scripture. Right there we have clear propositional communication about what we are to believe concerning God and what God requires of man. But this is better advice when it comes to exploring creation. This is better advice when it comes to seeking out, for instance, what scientific truths are about the way that God has organized and ordered the world. Right? God did not, in fact, hand a scientific manual to Adam when he created him. Right? He created Adam with faculties and giftings and abilities and expected him to use those to explore the world. What's the very first action we see Adam doing in Scripture? It's an intellectual action of naming the animals, of distinguishing each one according to its kind, of looking out with the eyes and the mind that God gave him to investigate the structure of the physical world and to organize it in speech. So this is not good advice for theological method. It's much better advice for scientific method. It's ultimately the fittedness that exists between our minds and the world that ensures that this quest is not in vain. Our souls are not foreigners to the rational realm, but natural citizens, having come from there originally and being destined to return there eventually. Now, perhaps most controversially of Plato's views, he describes this process of learning as a process of recollection. You may have encountered this in your studies. He says all learning is memory. All of the forms, all of the really real things in the world, at one level we already know. He thinks there already must be an implanted knowledge of the truth deep in our souls, and our experiences in the world and our arguments are aimed at helping us remember, to recollect that knowledge. And how do we come to recognize something as beautiful? It's remarkable that we can even do that with our minds. How are we able to do that? Certainly our taste can become more refined. We can grow in our understanding of it. But how do we recognize it at all in the first place? How did we get any taste to start with? Plato argues we must have, even prior to encountering beautiful things, had some intuitive grasp of beauty. To recognize something, we must already have some understanding of it. So there's a kind of a primeval gut-level grasp of the forms that gives us hope that we can indeed find the truth. We can recognize what these things are because we have some distant memory of them. So this idea that knowledge is recollection, it is, shall we say, implausible. It garnered few adherents among the pagans or the Christians. But the idea of innate knowledge implanted in our souls by God or by nature, that becomes one of the main epistemic options from this point forward. It is, in fact, a bit of a puzzle, how we come to know universal truths, truths that outstrip what the senses can tell us. Innate ideas are a plausible solution, although there are others. The medievals thought we had a rational power of abstraction, whereby we can abstract the universal from the particulars. Evaluated in the light of Christianity, worst of all, this idea that knowledge is recollection relies on the heretical doctrine that the soul preexists the body, not a thing that Christians believe. Plato thinks the soul preexists the body, and in that pre-embodied state saw this rational realm and so that now we can recall it and remember it. So he grounds this epistemic optimism in our soul pre-existence. Again, not popular, certainly not attractive to Christians. Okay, I'm moving towards the end now. With his theory of forms and the doctrine of recollection, Plato is capable of resisting two other intellectual trends of his day, and these I want to frame kind of the last few points here. In addition to materialism, Plato is concerned with skepticism and relativism. Skepticism and relativism. The pre-Socratic philosopher Xenophanes argued for skepticism. He claimed that the clear and certain truth no man has seen, nor will there ever be anyone who knows about the gods and what I say about all things. Even if in the best case one happened to speak just what has been brought to pass, still he himself would not know. Opinion is ordained for all. In fact, in the world of Plato and Socrates in the 400s and 300s BC, other intellectual trends pressed towards skepticism and relativism. As the ideas, the mythology about the Homeric gods falls more to the wayside among the intellectuals, that had the effect of inculcating skepticism more generally. The Greek historian Thucydides explains the Peloponnesian War entirely in terms of human affairs and human actions. Athena and Zeus don't explain why Sparta attacked Athens. Instead, it is Sparta's fear of Athens' growing power. Likewise, medical knowledge was advancing during this golden age of Greece, with new empirical approaches to medicine emerging from a new intellectual class. The old mythological explanations were dying, and materialism, relativism, and skepticism moved into that space. You may have heard about this group of intellectuals in ancient Greece called the Sophists, itinerant teachers with a reputation for wisdom. Some of them taught a new version of ethical realpolitik, as in Thucydides, with everyone acting for their own self-interest. You'll do likewise if you want to be free and happy. They offered to teach the skills necessary for self-fulfillment in democratic societies, with an emphasis on public presentation and public speech. Today, new sophists, if they were here, would teach you how to curate your Instagram and TikTok feeds so that you get invited to all the right parties. Some of these sophists taught a version of existentialism or relativism. Protagoras famously said, "Man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not." He would have fit in very well with the 21st century. The way things seem to you is the way they are. The way that you judge things is the way that things are in reality. Seeming and being are one. To make things worse when it comes to knowledge, another philosopher, Heraclitus, argued strongly that everything in the universe was in flux and motion. Change was constant. Nothing stays the same. And if nothing stays the same, it's hard to see how anything is knowable, except maybe where something was in the past. If tomorrow everything is different, then whatever I learned today is already out of date. Plato saw the force of these arguments and the dangers of skepticism and relativism, and he had a response. If the world is only matter in motion, then there's no way to resist these trends. We cannot know anything beyond the sensory. The world is, however we make it to be in our experience. But if the world is not just matter and motion, if there is a rational order accessible to our minds, if things do not just happen by necessity, if there is a spiritual realm which governs and directs everything, then knowledge is indeed possible. There are stable objects which can be known. Things which are constantly changing and perceived by the senses can only be grasped to a weak degree when compared with things that are unchanging. So the proposition, there are more than 100 persons in the room, is true, and it's a truth that can be known. But it is a proposition that will be false by midnight tonight. unless a group of mischievous students conspire to get 100 people back in here late tonight. So it's true now, but it will not be true at other times. To know that it's true, you have to go back and check. Are there more than 100 people in the room right now? Sometimes when you check, it won't be true. That's different from a proposition like 2 + 2 = 4. No mischievous student can pull off a prank that will make that proposition false. It's true now, and it will be true later, and you don't have to go check. You can see it just by gazing at it with your mind. What that truth is about is something that's unchanging, and so your mental grasp of it can also be deeper and unchanging. Things known by reason, when known truly, are more solidly stable than things known through the senses. Plato, in fact, is quite persnickety about this. He wants to call serious attention to this contrast. It casts the spiritual in a powerful light in relation to the bodily. Bodily things are known through the senses, but it is the non-material things, the things in the spiritual and rational realm, that are known through the mind. Plato is only willing to call knowledge those things that are known in a permanent and unchanging fashion. So he denies that you know that you have 10 fingers. Why? Well, that's something that can change. A bad accident with some machinery, and you might no longer have 10 fingers. Again, in the Republic, to make one more reference to it, right before the famous allegory of the cave, he gives an illustration of a divided line. The line has both a metaphysical and an epistemological scale. Just as there are corresponding degrees of being, there are corresponding degrees of cognitive grasp that we can have of that being. Plato uses 4 different Greek terms, ranging from lowest to highest, and translators struggle with how to interpret these terms. You might have encountered this as you tried to read this section. All those terms mean something like belief or knowledge in English. So we usually think there are 2 levels of cognitive grasp, either knowledge, when you know something that's true and have an account, or belief or opinion, when you believe something, but maybe it's true, maybe it's not, and you're not really that sure. Instead of just knowledge versus belief, Plato has 4 levels of cognitive grasp, corresponding to lesser and greater kinds of being. The highest kind of mental grasp is a clear and distinct mental understanding of something that never changes, including that thing's relation to everything else. That's very hard to come by. He calls that knowledge episteme. This is the way we can know the forms if everything goes perfectly for us. Other spiritual realities can also be grasped to a high degree, but they don't count as episteme if they can't be given clear definitions the way that a form can. So mathematical entities can be known with what he calls dianoia. Physical things can't be known in either of those ways. They're constantly changing, so our mental understanding of them is weaker. For physical things, he reserves the term pistis, often translated belief, and acacia, which just confounds translators. They use things like imagination for it. The lowest kind of cognitive grasp is the grasp we have of shadows and images, something we're faced with all the time, he thinks. Reflections, shadows are unclear. Those of you who wear glasses know the sort of thing. If you try to look around without your glasses, everything's kind of murky. The same kind of thing is reflected in the famous cave analogy, when once you make it out of the cave, you can't look directly at the sun because of the blinding brilliance of the light. You first look down at the shadows and reflections in the water. Only later do you look at the things themselves. That's why you have to take algebra and calculus to get you ready for heavy theology. You can, of course, have a very brief and fleeting grasp of a shadow or an image. They move quickly, there's not much to them. They are an image of a physical thing. The physical thing itself, for Plato, is a kind of image of the spiritual. So Plato's epistemology is at one level strange to us. He denies, quote-unquote, knowledge of ordinary things, even though he agrees that those things exist and we can have true beliefs about them. What we don't have is a definitional account of the being of the thing which is present in us in such a way that it will never change. The individual dog that you love and have become friends with is at one level rationally unknowable. Even though his doggy essence, the what it is to be a dog that he possesses, is something you can know in a more stable way. It's not that Plato is unfeeling, he's highly attuned to animals. It's that he wants us to distinguish importantly different features of the world. And again, to sum things up now, I'm reaching my conclusion. He wants us to realize that physical things are changing, the world of becoming, and they are dependent upon the spiritual, the world of being, which is eternal. It's that further world that is most important. That further world which structures and organizes this world even now. This world we are just passing through. The next world we will dwell in forever, if we are prepared for it. We all yearn for that world. We all feel the deficiencies present in this world. We all strive to achieve union with what is eternal and divine, to reach beyond ourselves to what is higher. But will we find it? And how do we find it? Now we're getting into ethics and theology once again, more on which next time. So Plato argues for the reality of the spiritual against materialism, against skepticism, against relativism. Here is a pagan in which there is much to admire and from whom there is much to learn. Thank you.
You used the phrase at the beginning, Plato's purported dualism. Is that you think that often representations of his dualism are inaccurate and he's not a dualist, or he is a dualist but not in how we think? So unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, okay. How much time do we have?
You've got about, not long.
So yes, he's a dualist in that he thinks there are two kinds of reality, spiritual and physical. And he's not as big a fan of the physical as he is of the spiritual. He thinks the body, he famously says in the Phaedo, the body is an impediment to knowledge and our acquisition of clear understanding. And when we look at his soteriology later, we'll see he does not believe in a resurrection of the body. He thinks it's better to escape the body than to be stuck in it. So that is a very sub-Christian view, as we'll explore some more of that. But he doesn't automatically say the body is bad. And I think all things considered, it's a stretch to attribute to him the body as like pure evil or something like that. What's evil is disorder and chaos for him. And what's good is order. The good is order, things in their proper place, everything doing what it ought to do, which is, of course, ultimately ordered to God. So the body cannot be as good as the soul, but in its own way, the body can be, better than being chaotic. Better to have a body, well governed by the mind, a body that is temperate, that is modest, that's not chasing after food constantly, that doesn't just want to sleep all the time and things like this. The body can become better.
Those are good words.
Yes.
So you're sort of tempering simplistic pushback against Platonism.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we should criticize Plato for things he's really wrong about and not oversimplify it. Yeah.
So moving on to a slightly different topic, and I'm going to hand it over to people for questions. The idea of memory in Plato, the fact that souls existed prior to that. So in the grad class we're doing at the moment, semiotics, looking at Augustine, he talks about the inability of words to teach anything. Signs are commemorative. You learn, the sign enables you to remember something, which sounds very similar to that, yet when you delve into it a little bit further, you realize that truth, which is capitalized and ultimately is Christ, will teach you the millisecond before you hear the sign, and then you remember that teaching. So there's an interiority to knowledge. So it sounds Platonic, but it also sounds an adaptation of what Plato is trying to do.
Yeah, so ancient philosophy is really fun, so is medieval philosophy. In medieval philosophy, you have Christians grappling with all these Greek ideas. The way that we grapple with Newton and Einstein today, they grappled with Aristotle and Lucretius and other people. And so certain parts of Plato were viewed as more Christian-friendly than Democritus, for instance. Like, if those are your options, Plato looks much better. So if they onboarded part of this Platonic account of knowledge, they have to come up with a better theistic way that it's going to work, a way that doesn't marginalize God as thoroughly. And there are all kinds of creative versions of this in the medieval world, in the early modern world as well. A verse that's significant for Augustine is, in his light we see light. And so Augustine and others and Augustinians are constantly trying to see the world in light of God's work in the world and what God has done and what God reveals. So there are creative ways to say, God is at work in this intellectual process. But Christians are going to reject the preexistence of the soul. But like you said, they're going to look for ways that God is enlightening the mind in a way that's not just mere physical processes, that God is kind of intimately involved in our lives, in what's going on and what we learn.
It's almost impossible to read those theologians without noting that interaction is taking place with what has gone before.
Yeah, and Augustine especially, he tells us in the Confessions he read a bunch of this stuff. So he probably didn't read Plato himself, but he read later Platonists. And so watching him grapple with it, in some cases adopt it, in other cases, but by the end of his life, rejecting it and so forth, is a really fun thing to watch.
Okay, now we'll open it up to the floor for questions. Bruce.
He argues that Plato's answer to the question, what is the good life, is both practical and intellectual. There's the intellectual component where you're contemplating the form, and the practical component where he gives the case of the form of beauty in the Symposium. You're not only contemplating this form of beauty, but you're loving the beloved, and that actually advances you towards the form of beauty, towards actually catching a sight of it. So do you agree with that interpretation of Plato? Does Plato believe that the good life has this practical and intellectual component?
And can you repeat the question so that people at the back know?
Yeah, so the question was about Plato's ethics and whether for Plato the good life is both practical and contemplative, as Copleston says and others. So I want to punt a bit on that because I haven't explored his ethics with you all yet, but so we're jumping the gun on that one. I will say for Plato and for others, there is I think a bias toward the contemplative in general. You can see this in the Republic, for instance, where the philosopher king is reticent to come back down and to do the annoying business of actually ruling and governing, which is not nearly as fun as doing science and math. So I think you see that bias towards the contemplative in the tradition. However, I do think there's some ambiguity to it, and Plato is concerned enough with action that it's hard to imagine he thinks a fully good life is one of total inaction in terms of practical accomplishment. So I would say on that particular point, that is in general correct. However, there's a preference for the contemplative overall. Later on, Cicero talks about this contemplative versus practical contrast in different lives, and he says a mixture is highly appropriate. And I think Platonists tend to favor the intellectual side, the contemplation of God, the prayer closet, more than the life down in the street and of commerce.
Okay. Other questions? Dr. Grisa.
Yeah, so the question was about the arts. It's often said that Plato rejects the arts, is kind of negative about the arts, and Aristotle's maybe more positive about it. Great question. I wasn't planning a full lecture on that, so I can feel free to just fire away. I mean, read Plato's works. They are works of art. There is no doubt. He is a master author, just as a writer. Really incredible, really incredible. So certainly the verbal arts he is very positive about. In a lot of early and middle dialogues, he really slams rhetoric and oratory. But by the end of his writings, he's actually positive about something like oratory, which maybe not an art, but it's verbal. Verbal beauty is part of it, and persuasiveness. And he thinks there's a place for it, just a subordinate place to truth. So art for the sake of truth, not art as its own end. But he is skeptical about some of the visual arts and concerned about them. He thinks they give bad representations of the truth, because the truth is more than just the senses. The truth is the form and the structure. Let's see, I wanted to say one more thing about the arts as well, the visual arts. I've forgotten it, I'll come back maybe. So I think, sorry to conclude, I do think he has a place for art, although he's much more concerned with art's effect on us and is skeptical about whole classes of art because of that. This is what I wanted to say. In the Republic, he famously kind of cast out the poets. This is part of it. But the problem is it's because the poets lie. They say things that are false about the gods. Like the gods castrate their father and eat them and things like this. This is terrible. The gods don't do stuff like that. So yeah, all that stuff has to go. But true stories about the gods, those have to stay. And they have to stay in part because we model ourselves on what we take to be true and high and beautiful and good. And so we actually need a good account of that in our community for us to aspire to. So he keeps them around, but he is very restrictive on them. He's not an American about it. He's not an Athenian about it. He doesn't just say, write whatever you want, corrupt whoever's mind you want, anywhere you want. He's very restrictive about what gets taught and not taught. And he thinks we should be very careful about the art we consume.
At the back, my eyesight, it's that lower form of knowledge that Plato was talking about.
Okay, this is a question of political theory, I think, and how Plato approaches some of the different cities he introduces in the Republic early on. Scholars dispute the meaning of certain passages. On the one hand, Plato and other philosophers are probably, overall, they are more Spartan than we are, and I'll talk about some of this next time. They would prefer a much simpler life compared to what most of us live, and luxuries really are a spiritual danger, he thinks. We come to love the world inordinately and compared to the higher goods. So I do think he is concerned about, when he introduces that next city, the acquisitive nature of it and the luxuries and those other material goods and comforts that we enjoy. He thinks those can be very damaging to the soul. And you might cite, say, the 20th century world as evidence of that today. So I think that's all I want to say about it for now, but I'd love to maybe follow up some more later.
Ruth.
I was waiting for someone to ask me that. No, really, how much time do we have? I'm a confessionally reformed Christian, and so I think outside of faith in Jesus Christ, and so outside of faith in God's Messiah, there is no salvation. What that means for unpreached, groups of people that have not been preached the gospel, is something that Reformed men and women have struggled with for a long time. And there's a whole history of trying to think about some pagans that really look like noble pagans. Socrates looks like a noble man in so many ways. Cicero looks like a noble man in lots of different ways. What do we make of their eternal destiny? I think apart from faith in Christ, there is no hope. But many things are unclear about all that. So I think, in general, I think speculating on people's eternal destiny is not the best use of our time. Instead, pursuing what is true and proclaiming what is good and proclaiming redemption that is in Christ is a better use of our time. So that's a short answer.
Of course, if Philo was right, he studied Moses, so he would have had opportunity.
Yeah, if Philo or some of the other early apologists are right, if Justin is right, then he already knew about the Messiah.
I couldn't tell whether this was you or Plato who said this, that you, when you were talking about coming out of the cave, and then you made it was almost a throwaway statement, you have to do algebra and calculus before you do the heavy lifting of theology. Was that you or Plato?
That's Plato.
That's Plato. Okay, do you agree with that?
So many students who love literature and the arts and history can have more difficulty with some scientific and mathematical subjects. And so I'd like to encourage students to embrace the totality of the things that we can learn and to actually see that in mathematical studies, it's much like studying Latin, actually, which of course you're required to do here. It teaches you very careful thinking, very analytically rigorous thinking. And mathematics teaches you to think about things that you can't see just with your eyes. When you're doing arithmetic and doing geometry, you are dealing with non-physical things. You might manipulate sticks or stones to do math. You know, when you teach kids math, you show them 2 sticks and show them 2 more sticks, and you say how many sticks and things. But when you're thinking about arithmetic truths, 2 + 2 = 4, that's not a physical thing anymore. So I do think, now I will speak for myself, I think Plato is right that mathematics is an essential part of any serious intellectual curriculum, and that a deep grounding in mathematics will help you do theology and philosophy better.
Would it be true to say a deep understanding of mathematics as Plato would understand mathematics would help you? I mean, a modern mathematical curriculum ignores completely the spiritual element.
Yeah, I'm thinking of bona fide arithmetic, geometry, good old circles, squares, scales and things. I wouldn't want that taught in an atheistic way. That obviously won't be spiritually beneficial. But thinking more like the skill of reasoning or the art of reasoning, mathematics is very useful for that. If you really get good at geometric proofs and deductions, that will help you as you're thinking through philosophy and theology.
Juniors? We just introduced more math into the curriculum.
Oh dear.
Well, I didn't set this up, I promise.
He didn't.
Yeah. Any more? I could keep talking, but any more questions out there? Brent.
Yeah, that's the danger of bringing up multiple philosophers. You might ask me a detailed question about some of them. So I'm not prepared to give a full answer to that. That's a great question that I'll just be honest, I'm not ready to fully talk about. Yeah, so one of the things I will say when you compare some of early Augustine to later is he puts more emphasis on biblical categories of thinking by the end of it than he does by the beginning of it. But that's a great question that maybe your professors can explore with you in class over the next year.
Okay. One last opportunity for a question. So one more. Phil.
Yeah, so the question is about Aquinas, and Aquinas uses Aristotle quite a bit, but doesn't use Plato hardly at all. Why is that? That I can say something about. Aquinas didn't have a copy of Plato that he could read. He had about half of the Timaeus, and that's it. And it was 200 years later until they had really good copies of Plato into Latin in the West. And a couple hundred years, after Aquinas, before in the early Renaissance, when there was a resurgence of interest in the original languages, and they recovered better knowledge of Greek, and more people could read Plato in the original at that point, and they collected manuscripts and so on. So Aquinas really didn't have much Plato to work with. What he did have was Augustine, and Aquinas talks about Augustine throughout his work. Aquinas intends to be Augustinian in many, many places. And so you do actually see some Platonic ideas crop up in Aquinas in different places. Even just degrees of reality, for instance, is a Platonic idea. So some of the Augustinian ideas are actually Platonic, filtered through later. But that's the short version on why he didn't quote Plato. He didn't have them. You'll see later thinkers doing more quoting of Plato, Reformation era, as you get in further.
Okay, it's nearly 4:25. Dr. Talcott, a tremendous start. Looking forward to the next 3. Thank you very much.